Good morning and welcome everyone to another Friday seminar arranged by the Center for Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oslo. This seminar for today is arranged in cooperation with the Oslo-based organization Masahat. Some of you might know it with its previous name, Space. And today Masahat is here represented by my colleague and friend Rana Isa, Dr. Rana Isa, who is here chairing the event with me today. So also Rana Isa, some of you might know her from before. She has been in Oslo for several years, affiliated to OIO. She's now working as a research fellow at OIO, but she's also associate professor in translation studies at the American University in Beirut. So our speaker for today is Leyla Dakhli, and I will introduce her in a second. I just wanted to say that this event is part of an online festival arranged by Masahat that has been going on already for a couple of days, which deals with the question of access to public spaces and homemaking in the exile. So Leyla Dakhli's work and lecture for today speaks directly to this theme. And we are very, very honored to have you, Leyla, today with us. Thank you. So I will briefly introduce Leyla Dakhli before giving the floor to her. Leyla is a full-time historian. She is affiliated to the French Center for National Research, and she is presently settled in the Mark Bloch Center in Berlin. Her work deals with the study of Arab intellectuals and social history of the South Mediterranean region, with a particular focus on the history of women and the question of exiled intellectuals and activists. And since 2018, Leyla has been the principal investigator for an ERC-founded program entitled DREAM, Drafting and Enacting the Revolution in the Arab Mediterranean. So her lecture for today will deal with, in this lecture, Leyla will tell us a little bit about this project, and she will talk to us about revolutionary dreams, revolutions, and archives. So the format for today will be that Leyla will give us a brief introduction to this project, roughly 20-25 minutes, and then we will follow with a discussion with some questions from me and Rana Isa, and then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. I would also like to remind you that the event is going to be recorded. So please, if you do not wish to appear in the video, please switch off your camera and or change your name. So without further introductions, Leyla, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here and to be presenting this work to you. Well, I will be sharing a presentation, so let me just do it right now. Share my screen with you. Is that fine? Okay. So I'll start with a very quick overview of the situation of archives in the context of the revolutions and the revolutionary movements in the Arab Mediterranean. And I'm very happy to present this work, which is a chapter which is not yet published, but I saw that in the public we have one of the coordinator of the book. He may tell us more about that. Hi, Zune. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of what I have been doing about archives, and then tell you more maybe about the project itself. So let me see if I can use this. Yeah, so this is the project itself. So first, whether in the case of raids on state archives that we have been seeing, for example, in Egypt during the last revolution, or in the case of the profusion of documentation to make archives, what has appeared clear to me is that the question of the archive, being it in the plural or in the singular, is revolutionary from the outset. The archival gesture of protest is caught in tension between the gesture of tearing archives away from institutions, thus from their destruction or concealment by the state, and that gesture of producing archives by collecting the words of the actors, a tension between accumulating evidence and accumulating memory. Although it's clear to me that the two movements are intertwining in many cases. In history, some revolutions destroy the archives. They have to make a clean cut with the past. I think that concerning the recent revolution, what is at stake is the link between memory and justice, as well as the link that establishes the revolutionary rupture or continuity. In this sense, revolutionaries most often work for the continuity of the state while trying to overthrow the regime. So they break the link between regime and state, and each in their own ways. So in regards to what happened 10 years ago, or starting from 10 years ago, two aspects stand out. The opening, even sometimes in a very ephemeral way, of once inaccessible or invisible state archives, as occurred, for example, in Egypt and Yemen in 2011, and is still occurring in Tunisia, for example. And the second aspect is the multiplication of private archiving initiatives, documenting in particular revolts and revolutions, but also older memories. Both raise several questions that I want to interrogate. Most important among them, does this private space, these private initiatives, complement or contradict the archive of power? So I will try to give you a first overall image of the relation between power and archives, which put at the center the state and its autonomy, its ability to size its own memory. This question seems to place the countries of the region in a situations that have been very often described of peoples without history, or at least without archives, since their archives are largely recorded by others, being them the colonial powers or more geopolitical documentation. I think there had been a lot of discussion about this, but maybe we can see it in a different way. Preservation, in the broadest sense of the term, tends to focus primarily on the manuscript treasures of national and private libraries in many of the countries here at stake. That is a very patrimonial vision of what archives are, whom they serve, and how they function. Memory, in these cases, resides in the precious nature of these documents, which have a high symbolic and real value. Here you can see one of the treasures of the Khalidiyya library in Jerusalem, which is, of course, a manuscript. So these treasures, then the archive they constitute, are similar to relics, the relics of knowledge, of law, of faith, as well as the relics of the states and its history. And then in this sense, national archives, is part of the national narrative. There are two, let's say, traditions. One is, in some of the countries, a centralizing tradition for archiving. That could be seen, for example, in Egypt or Tunisia. In these cases, access to national, municipal, or institutional archive obviously varies according to the country and to the context. Through the archives, one discovers also the true architecture of an authoritarian state, encapsulating the ministries in different layers of semi-formal institutions from the ruling party, the presidency, or the police apparatus, which constitutes the regime, and nizam, the system, the very one that revolutionaries are trying to overthrow. I will take two examples. One is Tunisia. So in the context of the new republic after 2011 revolution, archives are still the focus of civic and political battles. Paradoxically, the national reconciliation process has so far addressed the question of memory through the archive, if not through the action of Truth and Dignity Forum, and in 2018 through the collection undertaken in the exhibition before the 14th, Instant Tunisien in French, reconstructing the traces of the days of uprisings in 2010 and 2011. So this initiative came from the civil society and helped to build a specific archival fund dedicated to the revolution or to the archives of the revolution, most of them video or images collected from the people who participated in the events. The second case is the Egyptian case. In this case, in the context of the 2011 revolution and the subsequent coup, but also during the Morsi regime, archives have been at the center of a debate on the reception of sensitive documents and access to information in national history. Part of the mobilization took place about access to documentation, embarking on a reflection on the archives itself as part of the revolutionary process. The spectacular action of encircling certain buildings of the state security during the days of March was one of those acts. In other cases, like Lebanon, the question of state taking over the archiving and memory enterprise is not raised in the same way. The Lebanese National Archives is a somewhat ghostly institution, even if it actually does exist. These state archives, partially destroyed after the war, have remained relatively unknown and coexist with many private or semi-private, confessional or institutional archives, sometimes family archives, in a country where everyone protects its own memory or absence of memory. This reflects more the fragmentation of authority than its absence, and reveals a fusion between archives and memory. What is often interpreted as a failure of the state or a weakness of the state seems to reflect a confusion between memory and archives. For the most important archiving sites in the country are not substitute for the archive, but for memory. In this particular case, the civil war has superimposed itself on this specific structure of the state, producing holes linked to destruction, looting, and disappearance, contributing to further clouding access to and understanding of documentation, and also introducing an urgency of memory. So private heritage companies rely on this diagnosis to develop their actions, despairing of the state's ability to address traumatic issues and concerned about the demonstrated fragility of what is called the state and its institution. Here you have a picture of the Umam Documentation and Research Center, which is obviously one of the most important memory place in Lebanon and Peru specifically. And of course, it was very important for me to put it here today because, as you know, the founder of this initiative has been assassinated some weeks ago. We may go back to the specificity of this place, but like this picture shows it, it's not only a place where you can find documentation, it's also a place where people could gather to exchange ideas and see exhibitions related to the memory of the war, but also the memory of the country itself. So acting with the state, transforming the conditions of access and conservation, doing without the state in other cases, bypassing or replacing it, all of these actions affect the archival landscape and say something about the territory, its history, and its political situation. The collections bear in their very form, their existence or absence, their accessibility, the trace of violence or neglect. Very much in the case of the archive state, we also have seen cases of abductions, thefts, or capture of archives. I won't be very long on that, but this is important to mention because the history of the state archives is also made up of these silences, disappearances, and recordings. Like other treasures, the archives, are part of the spoils of the wars that have occurred on these territories. We could mention, of course, many of the documentation concerning Palestine after 48, that is actually now sealed in the archives and also the libraries of Israel. But the question we have mostly heard about was the question of the Iraqi archives and their abduction that was conducted by the United States after 2003. So beyond the political and moral question, arises here in a context where data are considered today as the foundation of governance and surveillance, a new question. Because if this story is very old, there is a new context for it. Data is considered as a new black gold, and the economic question and that of the wealth generated by these data and memory processing is very much a new one. I just mentioned it here because I think it gives another perspective to the question of abduction of data and archives. The second aspect of the relationship between power and archives is the one I mentioned before, the idea that people are now imagining other responses, proposals, and initiatives outside the state. Independent archival collection, as the one of Umam, for example, is an expression of political dissent with its own history. In the Arab world, a number of independent archiving initiatives are approaching this place of dissent, particularly since 2011. What seems to unite them is the way they make the archive an object for itself. They shift it from its understanding as a residue of institutional daily work, which is normal archive, let's say, or traditional archive, to perceive it as a more generic trace linked to its own inscription, whether it is writing, image, sound, or even a bodily inscription as incarnated in memory. I will try to give different forms of this independent archiving or contemporary independent archive. One of the first characteristics, I see in these new archiving is that it's very much linked to the media or to the idea of informing. The revolution were, as we know, made and documented in the same time. They have implemented real-time information techniques to counter national propaganda and have set up independent media centers based on a dense network of journalist activists. This is the dimension that can be found, for example, in the work of the collective Musirin and then the archive they created, 858. This archive that we see here, just a capture of the screen, is a collection that has its coherence and history, that of a media collective born during the Egyptian revolution. 858 is conceived as a closed project with a beginning and an end, and it reflects its particular time. But it also hosts other materials that are to be added to the collection. So it's conceived as something that is open to contribution. Starting from the archive, everybody's contributions are thought of and curated, fed with more informations, additions, or memories. These traces are meant to be used, and they can even occasionally become documents that be added to a court file, for example. They are proof for the continuation of the struggle in other way. This orientation is found in a number of sites whose objective is to feed media production to counter the propaganda of the regimes in place and accumulate evidence for justice. We can just mention the website Syria Untold, for example, about Syria, but I wanted to also to mention a more recent initiative, which is the one that has been done by a collective of women in Algeria who created a documentation of feminist struggles in Algeria. It was launched by two young scholars as a Facebook page, a year and a half ago. The idea of this page is not only to collect the recent event happening in Algeria, but also to collect older feminist material and to bring it back. So they also produced, for example, last 8 March, a new leaflet produced with the old archival material of the women's struggle in Algeria, and they distributed this leaflet in the streets of Algeria just recently. So the ways of reading, selecting and sorting are at the heart of the work of archive builders when they take the form of a website, for example. Thus, looking at this website, but I don't have the time to go through this. There is an architecture, a classification, but also above all, a circulation between documents that is developed. The contributions draw and record the echoes between the videos or texts or images, the tags that suggest path and transversal readings. Apart from the journalism, the media, the other very important aspect is the one that is connected to memory, and I will sum it also with the question of art and the link between memory and art. So beyond research and documentation in the strict sense of the term, the memory work developed through these online repositories constitutes what Cécile Boex calls, following Christophe Trény, the awareness-raising devices. So this is probably what unites all these initiatives, the belief in the ability of the archive to do a sensitive work. To say it very shortly, to touch. The capture of a moment of state mobilization or repression, the long-term testimony, whether formalized within the framework of a commission or systematic collection project, or just captured on the spot, are bits of direct emotions that are returned to us. In this way, the memory of mobilization replaces the emotion that arouse and create new ones, which are hoped to be able to extend the mobilization. Belief in the ability to mobilize these emotions emerged with the 2011 revolutions within them. In this sense, the sites of archiving can be read as repetitions of the revolutionary act of, and we can say that just they seem to remember hope. Beyond counter-information and dissent, beyond complex memorial attempts, one of the major places of reflection on archives and power is the world of contemporary art. These links is not completely new, of course, at least not in the articulation it makes between dissent, resistance, and practices. In the face of state propaganda, the use of creative forms of resistance implies the use of archival evidence to reveal other truth. Art has a new capacity to struggle by the trace. It orders and gives meaning. It also contributes to an aesthetic of the hidden. And archives are extracted to reveal what had been hidden. All this, in my sense, contributes to contemporary archival inflation and to a certain form of worship of the document. I could cite other examples, but I choose here to just capture the site of the creative memory of the Syrian revolution, founded by Sana Yazidi, So they collect what they call the creative memory. So it's not really about making art with the archives, but considering the archive as pieces of art, or at least creative pieces of the revolution. This site is actually very much a site of archives and very documented one, but this with the premises that all what you will find at this site is actually is considered as a piece of creative memory. I can come back to this after, I think, longer. The articulation between this multiple private initiative and the traditional state archive is not self-evident. They seem to constitute two parallel and separate worlds. So the ones of the states and the one of the activists, let's say. If we stick to the ethics of memory approach, some are substitutes for the failures of others. You could say this. They collect privately to do the preservation that the state does not do or hurts. The gesture or the accumulation of gesture, however, exceeds this ambition. It draws a democratic ambition for the archive, in particular through the very form it gives to these archives. The contributor, access, and order are at the center of what could be considered a counterpower based on a number of shared beliefs. I just evoke some of them: the idea of truth against the idea of lies, the disclosure against the hidden, and also the belief in the power of memory, and also the belief in the aesthetic that flows from all of this. This whole picture is where we start with the project Dream, actually. We aim to document these productions of archives and gather them. In doing this, we are facing different problems and questions. One is, of course, the question of access. But first we have to keep in mind, or you have to keep in mind, that the Project Dream does not build a new archive. It's not an initiative to build another archive. The idea is more to identify, to describe, and eventually to give access to some archival documentation. So the access is not only a question of security or ability to access physically a place. There are strategies to be able to access the state and local archives that had to do also with the idea of finding indirect ways to access documentation. So, for example, one could say that colonial archives, or let's say external archives coming from other countries, could be considered a way to indirectly access documentation that was or is still present in the state archive, but is not accessible for everyone. Or we could find ways to collect private archive. Of course, here it's written before it's too late, but also because these private archive could be considered as part of a more general archive. If you think of, for example, activists from groups or political party, some of them may have documentation that put all together could constitute or reconstitute the archive of this specific organization, of course. The second point is a very important one, is the question of plenty, because it's a lot. There is a lot of things, specifically in the recent times. We have been looking at all these videos, images, texts, and so on and so forth. And you feel that you actually can't do anything looking at all these websites and so on. So the idea is actually to find a way to have a comprehensive approach to the archives and to be able to circulate into this documentation. And this has to do, in our sense, with the fact that we choose objects transversal object in order to make or to trace the history of these revolutions, and also to find a way to capture and understand these archives. Of course, one has to think that we shouldn't be separating what we find as archives and what is considered published documentation, because most of what is also published on a website could be considered also published documentation, but this is a specific question maybe. The last point is, of course, choosing and creating archives. So we do actually choose paths into archives, special object, themes, actors. We also choose places, specific places, to do microhistory of this global revolts. And we also create archives. What does it mean? It doesn't mean that we actually do this kind of initiatives I've been talking about, but that we, as researchers, consider ourselves as producers of archives with the work we are doing on the revolutions. So, of course, creating archive is also depositing material as interviews or mental maps or whatever documentation we can also gather. But this comes with the idea that the project is actually doing a mapping of the archives of revolts and revolution in the region. So the last point I would like to raise here is that we actually started, of course, to work with these archives, and we recently published this book in French. It's called L'Esprit de la Révolte, the spirit of the revolt or the revolution, which is actually based on pieces of archives. And we think, like most of the activist initiatives I've been talking about before that there is something useful in the re-mentioning of archives, the rebuilding of archives. And this is the act of going back to the emotions of the revolution. As we are going to, with the project, we are digging into the idea of the emotions that are linked to the revolution. One of the best way to do it is actually to look at the archives of these revolts. And so for the book, we actually selected some archives we found relevant to tell the story of some of the most revealing histories of the past revolutions. And we actually try to interpret these archives to be able to give a sense of what the spirit of the revolt was. So I'm not going to go deeper into the book because it's a whole story on itself. But I think this is one of the first steps we made in approaching the question of archives in a very different way as the historians do usually, because usually historians go to archives and they find series. So if you go to archives, you have to find a lot of documentation, and you don't stop until you have a lot, and then you can find the arguments you want to do with the archive. The book is constructed completely on the contrary. It starts with a very small archives, and it's really the sense of what microhistory could be interpreted as. It's like starting with a very small archives to be able to tell more about what it was happening actually, not only in this place where the archive was found, but also in the whole region. So I think it's also a way for us to interrogate the discipline itself, the history, but also its connection to what could be done as anthropologists, to be able to understand in the same time the archives and their many producers, as we are now, all of us are producers of archive in the context of these revolts and revolutions. I'm going to stop here so that we'll be able to have the discussion. I think I've been so long. I don't know. I don't have my. And I will thank you for listening to me. Stop this sharing. Yes, here we are again.
Thank you, Leyla. Thank you very much. I think this was brilliant, and it also raises very many questions. So I can start maybe with one. I could start actually where you ended, right? About the work you are doing in the Project Dream. I was thinking, if you could, what kind of reflections are you now making about the role of historians, right? In this, if you want to call it post-archival era, where basically you have to make sense of these very different kind of archives. And also if you could comment a little bit of how accessibility to these state archives has changed after, and if it has changed after 2011.
Well, thank you. Well, yes, I'm happy to be telling more about the connection with the historian's work. First, I have to say I'm a believer. I'm a historian. I have faith in it, but I'm also because I think it's a good occasion for us historians to go back to what our work with archive is actually. Because I was telling the story of these historians who want to get series, but it's not what we do as historians of the Middle East and North Africa, because we don't have this series very often. And it's not only because we don't have them that I think it's good not to do this. It's also because working with archives is also understanding the building of the archive itself. So this situation where we have a profusion of different kind of archiving and archive producers and so on pushes us to actually go back to this work of revealing the production of the document and reading it in the same time. So not only just reading documents and say what they say, or even interpret them in a very interesting way, but I think integrating the reflexive gesture into our own work. So this is, I think, very important, and this is what we actually try to do in the combination of anthropological work on the production of archive and the reading of the archives themselves. So this is where I think we try to work with the project. The second question of accessibility is, of course, a very difficult one. We know we had from the start of the project problems of accessibility in different contexts. For example, in Syria, of course, in Libya, and in Egypt in many ways, because they decided to close the national archives for foreigners, but also then after they take like more than a year or two to give access to others, and so on and so forth. So this is the typical, let's say, classical problem of access. But there are others. I think the accessibility has to do, this leads us to be creative. I don't want to be too positive, naive, but I think it's also interesting sometimes to see how you can get to find things you thought you wouldn't have. For example, I was supposed to go before the Corona crisis to Moscow to see archives, because some of my colleagues, I knew I was going to go because there was this idea of this cooperation with the Soviet bloc and this idea that there's something to be found there. But there is more, because they were actually also gathering informations from their own agents or whatever. So you can find also original documentation from the states and powers in these archives with very different perspectives if you are in the Foreign Office in London or in Moscow. So the combination of these perspectives and the way they were actually taking the documentation and picking what they wanted to pick into this documentation is also very, very interesting for us. Also, of course, to identify people, to identify. So this is why I think the strategy of finding objects or moments is very interesting. I just give an example recent because I've been working on these food riots of the middle of the 80s. I worked on Tunisia, but other colleagues were working on different places. But for Tunisia, working on this was very interesting, also in terms of archives. So when I worked, I said, okay, I'm going to try to find things in the National Archives. I couldn't actually find the files or the police files or the security files, which are not visible or available, or I don't know what happened. So I found some things, but not very relevant. And then I turned to another kind of analysis and I said, so, okay, these neighborhoods where the riots actually happened were neighborhoods that were in the process of being rehabilitated. So there is a whole huge documentation about these neighborhoods and the projects that were going on in the neighborhoods. And in this documentation, so urban planners archives, you find a huge documentation on the population. You have data, you have interviews, you have, like, this is something really rich for social history. So combining what you know about the riots and you could know from interviews, and the traces of the revolts and so on, and this documentation, you really could get to what was actually happening in these days. So this is what I mean by creativity. It's like looking sometimes a little bit on the other side to be able to combine archives and not being obsessed with the fact that you actually have one archive telling the story of an event or a specific question.
I'd like to follow up on the question of the historian, but ask it from a more theoretical angle by focusing on the temporalities of archive. So you talked about how archives have been used as a counterpower against the narratives, or that can be utilized against the narratives of the regimes. And I was wondering, you know, a few days ago, Daraj made a small video about the memory of the Syrian revolution, asking the question, what would have happened to the world had Bashar al-Assad fallen in 2011? And one of the participants in the video answered, we would not have been collecting archives. We would have been doing something else. So the question is, how does the archive work as a compensation for a future that is not being realized today at the present? And how do you, you also in a way problematize this idea of the archive as a return to history and insist that it is, you know, you're talking about real time, you're talking about the present. So how do you, can we talk a bit about the temporalities of archiving?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. From what I hear, there are two different questions. So the idea of the compensation is very important, I think. And well, I think, of course, if Bashar, yeah, I guess it's right. I guess we wouldn't have been like doing so much archives. And it's actually, sorry, it's actually very visible with the Tunisian example too, because they had to go back to find the archives, and it was all it had all disappeared from the internet, and this is why they actually did this big collections of archives with the National Archive. But more than that, I think it serves two purposes for Syria. It's not only a compensation, it's a way to continue the struggle and to serve justice, because now the struggle of the Syrian people is also very much happening in justice and in gathering actually documentation to be able to to follow up with in court. Then the question of temporality. Yeah, I mean, history is now. I mean, like we're doing history now. We're not like we're writing history now. It's not. But then, if I get the point you are making, I think it's one of the very interesting topic today in our now, that actually revoltees and activists are using the past and like bringing back the past into their own present, which is something that we just forget to interrogate, because it's really, it seems obvious that people are coming back with old memories, and there has been a lot written about like Benjaminian theories and so on, and the way revolution is always done for the fathers, for the memory of the revolts that didn't happen or failed before that, and so on. It's this, but it's also something else. I think it's really much actualizing the older revolts during the present revolt. So the question of temporality is very much in the era where this game you were mentioning about, it's not a game, but I hope it was reality, about Bashar, this counterfactual history, if something had happened, is actually played in the ground of the revolt itself. So if I was talking about these Algerian women, I think it's a performative use of archives that is actually done in this. Oh, sorry, I knew this was gonna happen. Have to tell you, I couldn't find my telephone to be able to switch it off, so it's gonna happen. That's it. It is registered, I know. Yeah, so I think one has to take into account this games with temporality to understand what is actually at stake now with the archives. Yeah.
Teresa, you're on mute.
Yes, I'm here. I was also fascinated by this point you made about the different media you are dealing with in the archives. Right, you had this picture of the manuscript from the archive, and then you pointed out how most of the material that is collected now are oral history and images and videos. So I'm thinking also at what, I mean, what does this mean in terms of memories that they create? So how do you deal with this multimediality, and also the fact that these websites, you were mentioning, they have their own structures, their own way of accessing. I'm thinking they also create a more interactive way of making history, right? I am the viewer of a website. I may start wherever I want, and then I can jump to another one. So what is your reflection about the structure of this data, this nature of this media, and the memory they create?
Yeah, this is a big question, and it's also a big problem, I think, for us to be able to find our way in all this documentation. I mean, of course, we know that like the more you go into history, the more you have documents. So, of course, starting from the antiquity, where you have like pieces of texts and some archaeological material, and then more and more you have texts and laws and whatever, and the work of the archivist is to throw away. I mean, like most of them will tell you that like doing archive is like really selecting. So this is why I think we shouldn't be facing the whole flow of documentation which is in front of us, but rather understanding what the producers of archives are doing. This is why I'm telling that these initiatives are producers of archives, because what makes them really interesting, and at least what makes them possibly archives for us as historians, I'm not talking about like everybody, is that they actually have this ability to order, to actually curate their own archive. And this is what makes this legible. Without it, I'm not sure I can work. I mean, like looking at the flow of what is circulating on, let's say, the last Lebanese revolution, for example, in Beirut, like you have a lot of pictures, images, videos, and so on. But how can you work with that? Just like this. Then when you have someone or an institution or a collective who is actually collecting and producing an archive, then there is something to be read through this material. This is what's happening with Umam, or even with the collection that was made with the AUB, is that you can just, at the moment where you have this production of, there is a legibility, there are like classifications, and then you can deal with this. You can say maybe it's can be also stupid, but at least you have a legibility. It's easier when it's actually a real producer. When you have 858, you know who they are, you know why they did this and how they got to the images, and even the horizontality of the production of the archive is interesting for us as historians to look at. But it's inside this production of archive. Can you see the difference? I think it's, maybe it's because I'm not able yet to deal with the larger archive and say, okay, this is happening, I'm going to just collect for myself documentation and then work with it. Maybe it's just that I'm not able to do it, but I think it's also because one needs to find a way to have the people behind the documents, the people or the institutions. If you don't find the people, I mean, it's unreadable. I mean, it's readable for artists who could use them in their own work. It's readable for, even for media, it's a little bit difficult because you need to have to focus on like the circulation of documentation. But for us as scholars, I think it's really difficult to work without this, because what is interesting for us is the people. So if you don't, if you can't bring back the people with the archives, you feel a little bit, I mean, it's frustrating and it's even not really worth it, I guess.
No, I agree completely. Yes.
Can I have last question?
Sorry?
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, I didn't answer on the multimediality. So yeah, maybe there is no easy answer to that, but I think one of the things that is also very striking in this recent period is that the image is so much there that you, when we were writing the book, for example, with the team, we actually said, I mean, like, it's too much images at the end, too much videos, too much images. It's as if these revolutions were told only with images. So, and some of them are very famous. So I consider that like our work is also to transform images into texts in many ways. So like find a narrative that fits this whole circulation of images, but also dig into the archives to be able to find discourse and texts, because of course images are also a way to tell things. But I guess there has been a lot of very articulate discourses in the revolutions that we have to find, and we need to find them also to be able to give voice to the people, which is still the same thing. I mean, you can find the image of the people, you can find, you can read also through the videos, many things you can tell with that, but sometimes it's good also to find or to be able to give voice. Actually, Rana, this is what I'm trying to do also with the scholars, the endangered scholars. So you talk about people, and sometimes you know that these people are talking themselves. So it's also very, very important to be able to give voice and not to speak always for them. So this is the combination of medias. Yeah, it's not direct answer to your question, but I think it's my way.
Teresa, do I have time for one more question or before we open?
Yes, you can, and you can ask last question, and I will also start asking the audience. If you want to ask questions, just start raising your hand, so then we can follow the order. Please, Rana.
I wanted to follow up on this in terms of context. So you talked about the abduction of archives, and I'm wondering also the exile of archives. Like if we think of the creative memory of the Syrian Revolution that had to relocate to Paris, with the relocation of Sana to Paris, and someone like Khaled Fahmy, who was on the one hand asked by the state to collect revolutionary archive, and then for that reason he became a persona non grata in Egypt and now is in Cambridge. So I'm wondering about, you talk about this as well in one of your articles on the archives, about the neutralization of the archive when it's removed from its context. I'm also wondering if we can think, since you very nicely emphasize the people behind the archive, how can we also think of the exilic intellectual that leaves those local sites, and in a sense, do they also get neutralized because they have left? Or so how can we think about, the location of the archive, the location of the intellectual, and the effects, or
Well, I think that, like, I would say that the exile is not a neutralization of the context, because it's the step. It takes a step with the person or the group who is leaving, actually. From a different context, you can see like there are other examples, like a Russian example of this association Memorial, who is actually now also in exile, but is still doing the work of archiving and giving access to archives on Russia. So I think if it's still the same people who are actually bringing the archives and working on that, I think most of the collective of 858 is also in exile. Most of these initiatives are actually in diaspora right now. So we're talking of almost all of them. But the significance of the initiative is still there because it's still it's following the people. But I have to say, when I said like the neutralization of the archives, it was much more about the thefts or the abduction of the archives by other power. So it's like you can leave it in the same place. If it's taken by other people, then it's not the same. It's the case, of course, of Israel and Palestine. So most of these things are in the same places or almost in the same places, but it was replaced by another order. Then you can't read it in the same way. All the libraries that were actually taken in 48, which are now inside the National Library in Israel, they are there, but you can't read it as they were. You can't find actually a way to go through these archives. So it's completely another history that you can actually write with them. So I would say that exile is, at least on the first generation, and if you think of them, of this documentation as being kept and taken care of, is a continuation also of the struggle, in many cases at least. But then I'm very concerned with the fact that this is also, of course, a danger for the archive, the integrity of the archive, the security of it, but also the conservation of it. And this is part of what we try also to do with DREAM. It's actually to find ways to put this in safe places and to have copies and to be able, with the idea, this is going to be going back home one day. But then in between, it's of course very important to find safe places, as we know that like the previous exilees also lost a lot of documentations and archives. So the work of going back to them now and trying to rebuild network, find collections of journals and so on is very much difficult because none of them was really thinking in terms of archives, which is a little bit more the case now than before, I would say.
Thank you, Leyla, for these answers. I will now open the floor for questions from the audience. I see already one hand raised, Inanna Osman. Inanna, Jonathan, you can unmute.
Hello.
Yes, please.
I don't know if you can hear me. Thank you a lot.
Yes, you can.
For your
Yes.
talk. I would love to maybe introduce myself, to maybe give you like an idea of in which field I'm kind of dealing with archive and memory. I'm working with the Syrian archive based in Berlin. And I have been involved in two projects. The first one we started in 2019, where it's called Rehumanization of the Syrian Digital Memory, where we were trying through narrative interviews with like videographers or people who were participating or part of the documenting practices or archiving practices in their cities, trying to understand the social life of this process of production, as Leyla also called it. And I have to, I don't have maybe a clear question, but I'm questioning also my maybe mystifying way to look at the archive production regarding the aspect of authority, power over temporality, over history. So I think if we stay in this term of production, after conducting so many interviews in the first project, I heard lots of people like saying, yeah, I have my personal archive. I was part of producing this, documenting content, but I am afraid of what I produced. Yani, if we stay in the term of production, so yes, I do see. I did believe in this reclaiming, reappropriating the right of history and the authority over history and history writing and making. For sure, I think that Syrians, for example, in this context, could gain this to be part of the production, but they don't own the product. If we talk about archive is an intellectual construct that we maybe now observe and investigate. But my very romanticizing maybe way to look at this, I couldn't really believe when so many people told me, yeah, I am afraid to re-enter my archive. I am afraid to re-access this product I produced.
Yeah.
So even like our work in the Syrian archive, we are trying to perceive and also to protect archival crowdsourced contents that had been deleted by Google and YouTube, and that also includes lots of evidence for human rights violations and so on. So yes, I think Syrians could maybe, and this is what I maybe learned from these interviews, that yes, maybe we should not also overestimate this agency that people regained through their archival practices, because we don't own this product, since there is like a huge difference in the privilege people have in the world regarding, you know, the digital space. So yeah, there were the internet maybe offered a way to participate, to reclaim authority over history and temporality, but still even this digital memory that Syrians were part of creating it is they don't own it. If like even like in our work, we are working also with Amnesty on the digital archives that had been created by people, but still even everything we work on archive is not that accessible to the people. And maybe it's also important to demystify the archive, because do we also how should we understand when a videographer tells you, yeah, I am afraid now today to access my archive? What does it mean for us regarding terms of dream and hope and also future? What does it mean for these people who were part of this production to not be able to really consume this product and have an accessibility to this product? I hope I could make myself clear, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Leyla, I may collect one more question if you want.
Yeah.
And then you can reply to both of them together. So I have Aylaf Badreddin.
Yeah, hello, Leyla. It's so nice to see you. Hello, everyone.
Hello, Aylaf.
My name is Ilaf. I'm a postdoc in University of Marburg, working on music, Syrian music now. Maybe I have like a small comment and maybe a challenge for all of the experts who are working on archives. Is first of all is the language, that in different languages we have. I mean, when we talk about source language text, I mean, especially when you, Leyla, talked about the big visual elements we have, and we try to create like a narrative for them. I mean, here in this sense, like between, I mean, like Arabic, if we can say, like those are the source language of those documents, and then like when we create narratives of them, how do you deal with this? A second comment or a challenge I see it is with the appearance of documents or new documents all the time. Is, for example, me in my PhD, I worked also on having like a special or a small private archive. But now after I finished, I saw that there is a new guy called Hassan Turkmani, for example, with like thousands of documents. And then I said, okay, what is I mean, here, like I'm talking about our readings as archivists for the present documents we have, and how our reading is affecting and will be affected in the future with appearance and disappearance of documents. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ilaf. Leyla, would you like to answer?
Yes, I mean, like these two comments and questions are very much connected. So I'm okay. We don't have I myself don't have solutions for everything, of course. But I think what is interesting with this period is that we can contribute to create solutions, or I don't know. I mean, one of the questions is to give access to more people. This we actually can't decide for alone. I mean, it's like all these initiatives have this ambition to actually give access to more people, and they do it in being open on the web. So, and we know not everybody has access and so on, but at least, I mean, it's the way they try to answer this question. For me, I can't do this because I'm also tied with ethical questions related to my profession. So I can't actually give access to material that could endanger people or even name them. So it's not for me to decide what is accessible and what will be accessible. So I'm like just a mediator, and the more that I can do is actually to put material in a place that will help to save them, to save the material. So it's an archive we work with, actually, it's very open. We work with the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam, and this is where a lot of activist documentation from all over the world is kept, and sometimes it's only kept, you can't even access it as a researcher. So there are different levels of security for different levels of documentation. Another thing is the question of healing, or the question of the relationship to the archive. And this is something we actually see very often, of course. I also see people that tell me, you know, I have things, but I don't feel like opening them. I don't want to get back to this. And it's and this is also a question of temporality. Sometimes you just need to not to look at these things for a while, or just, yeah, or just to even to forget them for a while, or I don't know, because as one of my the researcher I work with, who was part of the revolutions, told me, he was like, it's like as if these days of the revolution were just one life inside my life. So I'm kind of, I can't completely relate them to what I am now. So it's difficult to go back, because every hour is worth 15 hours of today or something like this. It's like the extension of the time. So this is where anthropology of archives come also for us, because this is why we also want to understand what is happening with this relationship people have been establishing with their own, what they call their own archives, and which is different from what I call archive in a more systematic way, because it's a personal memory. It's also something that sometimes you also remember why you were taking this with you, or where we were registering or keeping these documentations. So all these levels of memory are very important, and it has to do also with the trauma, of course, but also the capacity of healing with or without. So with forgetting or relating to these memories. So yeah, I think it's a very important point, but it has many. I think there are many different questions in your comment, Imana, and all of them are very important, I think, in terms of how you collectively are able to share and to diffuse the work with archive, but also how individually and in the communities these relationship to the archives are at stake. Elaf, yeah, so, but the second part, your second question, Elaf, was actually connected to this, I think, how you're reading, but you were more talking about the reading of the scholar, is how it is affected by the proliferation or the appearance, as you say, of documents. Well, this happens all the time. So I mean, this is part of the research, I think, like to see things and not to see others, and sometimes to discover other evidence or other documentation that would be or can be helpful to understand or to raise new question. I think we're not done with that. It's not because we know already that there is a lot that we won't be discovering even more or even different documentation in the future. And I think this is, of course, very good. I mean, I'm not sad of that. I think it's very interesting. The question of languages is, I mean, it has to do with the multimediality in a way, but it has also to do with the translation inside the document. I think Rana is more an expert than me for this, but I'm interested in that too, because I think, and also because I know your work enough, and I think it's like, it's a multiplicity of translation and translationality that can be explored through the documentation. These archives contain also this. You worked a lot also, Elaf, on the translation between the regime and the revolution in Syria, like how they were using this language, the official language of the regime, to counter it, and so on and so forth. And this is where I'm not sure this is always happening with the image in the same way, but it is also like there is an aspect of counter propaganda in the way people were just shooting inside the demonstrations, also to be able to produce another kind of aesthetic, which is not the one of the propaganda regime. So like in terms of also of images, there is a lot to be said on that. And I think it's a very interesting way to get into this documentation and to get into the question of archiving. And of course, there's a lot to be said on the different local Arabics and the way they were circulating in between the different localities. Yeah. Did I answer? I'm not sure.
Yes, you did. Yes. Okay. If there are no further questions or comments, I think we could also stop here.
Okay.
Right? Okay, I see no hands raised so far. Okay, Leyla, but this has been really, really rich and thought-provoking. So
thank you.
I would like to really thank you also on behalf of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oslo, and I would like to thank also Masahat, Zainab Ali, and Rana Isa for participating with us to this event and creating also this conversation.
This was a wonderful conversation. I also want to thank you, Leyla, for this very enriching talk that will leave many questions for us to answer for years to come.
Exactly. It's good to be living with questions. Thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation, and thank you all for listening to me.
Thank you,
Thank
Leyla.
you.
Soon.
Thank you, everyone, for participating, and have a nice weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.